We are tackling Dr. Campbell's Psychology Throughout Life lecture, which sounds very formal and academic, but it's actually really fascinating. And get ready for some serious light bulb moments because we are unpacking big names like Freud,
Bowlby,
Piaget,
Kohlberg.
like the whole gang is here. But you know what I really appreciate about Dr. Campbell's approach is that he doesn't just throw these theories at us. Right. He really emphasizes this lifespan approach to the whole thing. So let's introduce some of these big thinkers. First up, Freud, with his theory of psychosexual development. So Freud argued that our libido,
That's our psychic energy.
yes,
Gets channeled into different parts of the body as we age.
John Bowlby. Bowlby's attachment theory.
Attachment theory. It's all about those early bonds that we form with our caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
He said that secure attachment in infancy creates this secure base, which is like this feeling of having a safe haven, to return to when things get tough.
It's like that classic image of the toddler at the playground who's venturing out to explore, but then always runs back to mom or dad for a quick hug before heading back out again.
And that secure base gives them that confidence to go out and explore,
Right.
knowing that they're not alone.
Right.
And those early attachment patterns can have a huge impact
Oh, yeah.
on our relationships throughout life.
Okay, so we've got those early experiences shaping our attachments.
Right.
But how do our brains actually develop? Enter Jean Piaget
Of course.
and his theory of cognitive development. So Piaget was all about how our thinking abilities change over time. And he observed that kids go through these distinct stages. So a 5-year-old's understanding of the world is just completely different from a 15-year-old.
Totally different. Speaking of arguments, what about our sense of right and wrong? That's got to develop over time too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Lawrence Kohlberg comes in with his theory of moral development. He argued that our sense of morality evolves over time, starting with a focus on avoiding punishment
Oh, yeah.
when we're really little,
Right.
and then moving to more complex ideas
Okay.
about fairness, justice,
Okay.
and universal ethical principles.
So that whole "because I said so" line
Right.
might work on a 5-year-old,
Yes,
but a teenager? Give me a better explanation.
exactly. And they're going to start questioning those rules.
Yeah?
Which is normal.
Yeah.
It's part of moral development.
It's a good thing.
Yes.
Okay, so we've covered Freud's psychosexual stages, Bowlby's attachment theory, Piaget's cognitive development,
Mm-hmm.
Kohlberg's moral development. We still need to talk about Erik Erikson and his theory of psychosocial development.
Okay, so he's the one with the 8 stages of life. So those 8 stages provide a helpful roadmap
Yes.
for understanding the key challenges we face.
But Dr. Campbell adds an interesting twist. He introduces this concept of emerging adulthood in their late teens or 20s. Dr. Campbell argues that today's young adults
Mhm.
are taking longer
Yes,
to hit those traditional milestones.
milestones are changing, being pushed back.
So, finishing school, landing a stable job, getting married, buying a house,
Yeah, all those big ones.
which, if we're being honest, tracks with what we're seeing
Right.
in society. There's this whole new phase of life.
But there is where young people are just trying to figure things out, both personally and professionally.
Trying to find their place.
And that is what he calls emerging adulthood, a period of exploration and identity formation that can last well into the 20s
It can.
and even 30s.
For some people.
For
right?
some.
Yeah.
So it's like adolescence got an extension.
But seriously, this emerging adulthood thing, fascinating. And it presents its own unique challenges
Yeah.
and opportunities that are worth exploring.
Definitely worth exploring.
But for now, let's dive
Yeah.
into those stages of life.
Let's do it. Starting with the most adorable stage of them all, infancy. Those tiny humans all bundled up. What is going on
Right.
in those little brains? And I think Erikson really hits on something
Okay.
with his first stage of trust versus mistrust. Babies are completely dependent
They are.
on their caregivers.
For everything. Food, warmth, comfort.
So if those needs are met consistently,
Yes.
then they learn to trust
Yes.
that the world is like a safe and predictable place.
Right. But if their needs aren't met,
Right.
if they're neglected,
Yep.
that's when mistrust can take root. And that's where Bowlby's attachment theory. He said that those early bonds form the template for all of our future relationships. That secure base.
Let's move on to toddlerhood because things get really interesting. Erickson called it autonomy versus shame and doubt, which I feel like every parent listening is nodding along.
It really is all about that independence.
They want to do it themselves.
Yes, they want to do everything themselves.
It's all part of the process.
It is. And as children move into the preschool years, that sense of self continues to develop.
Speaking of preschool, Erickson called this the initiative versus guilt stage.
Initiative versus guilt. So they've mastered walking and talking. What more could they want? Well, now they're interacting with the world in a bigger way. They're making friends.
Yes.
Engaging in pretend play. So it's like they're graduating from I can do it myself
Right.
to look what I can do.
Exactly. And this is a crucial time
Okay.
for developing a sense of purpose
Yeah.
and confidence.
It's a really important time.
It is, but it's also a time when they can experience guilt.
Oh,
They feel like they've done something wrong
wait.
or disappointed their caregivers. So it's a fine line
It is a fine line.
between encouraging that independence and setting those boundaries.
Right, because you want them to feel confident, but you also have to have some rules.
And this is where I think parenting styles really come into play. But before we get into that whole debate, let's not forget about Freud. He argued that they developed these unconscious desires
Okay.
for their opposite sex parent, which he called the Oedipus complex for boys and the Electra complex for girls.
While most modern psychologists don't really subscribe to Freud's theories literally, it is interesting to think about how those early family dynamics and relationships might influence us. All right, back to school. We go elementary school years. Erickson, I think, really nailed it
Okay.
with this whole industry versus inferiority idea.
Yeah, because school becomes their main thing. It's where they're tested, ranked. They're learning to read and write and do math and trying to fit in with their peers.
And make friends. A lot of pressure.
So no wonder some kids get totally stressed out about grades, extracurriculars.
Well, they want to feel like they measure up.
Yes, and thankfully it sounds like things calmed down a bit on the Freudian front during this stage.
Okay.
He called it the latency period, right?
He did call it the latency period.
Which, trust me, parents, you will appreciate this. Freud believed that psychic energy that we've been talking about takes a little bit of a backseat.
Those unconscious desires take a temporary hiatus as kids focus on other things, like developing their skills, making friends, navigating the social world of elementary school.
And speaking of friends, Bowlby would be very happy about this stage of development.
It's prime time for chumpships.
It is to blossom.
It's like they're creating these little tribes within the larger school ecosystem, which is so fascinating.
And those groups can be really powerful in shaping kids' values and interests and even their sense of identity.
Okay, so they're figuring out friendships, they're mastering multiplication tables, but what about their moral compasses? Are they ready?
To debate ethical dilemmas.
Yes.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Kohlberg would say that they're in the stage of conventional morality.
Where their sense of right and wrong is still largely based on following the rules and seeking approval.
Okay, so less about like questioning the rules and more about following them to be a good boy or a good girl.
Exactly.
And we enter adolescence, ages 12 to 18.
The teenage years.
So they're going through all these physical changes, emotional ups and downs, and the social dynamic. And in the midst of all of that, they're supposed to figure out who they are. No wonder Erickson called this stage identity versus role confusion. They're trying on all these different identities, testing boundaries, figuring out where they fit in. Think about like those classic high school stereotypes.
And of course, let's not forget about those hormones.
Right.
Freud would have a field day with this stage. He called it the genital stage, where those romantic and sexual feelings really come to the forefront.
They do.
Puberty hits.
And everything changes. And suddenly those relationships take on a whole new meaning.
Those first crushes.
Oh, yeah.
Those first heartbreaks.
And this is where I think those early attachment patterns come into play. Because if you had those secure attachments early on.
It makes those early relationships a little bit easier to navigate.
So those middle school breakups.
Oh, yeah.
Which might seem trivial at the time.
Totally.
Are actually really significant.
They are. They can be really important.
Because they're learning so much
They are.
about themselves,
Yes.
about what they value in other people, how to handle those really complex emotions
Absolutely.
that come with relationships.
It's all part of the process.
Okay, so while they're navigating those ups and downs of
Yeah.
teenage romance,
Right.
their brains are still developing.
Piaget called this the formal operational stage,
Okay.
where they develop the ability to think abstractly, to reason logically, to consider hypothetical situations.
Okay, so that explains how they can debate philosophy 1 minute and then forget to take out the trash
Yeah.
the next.
Classic.
It's all part of the process, developing those critical thinking skills, but also still learning how to manage their time and make those decisions.
Make good choices.
So they're capable of great things, but they might still need.
A little reminder.
This brings us to that fascinating new stage, emerging adulthood.
Emerging adulthood, yes.
This is where things, I think, get really interesting.
Yeah,
For those of you listening with older kids.
Okay.
So remember those traditional milestones? Those are happening later and later. And it's like adolescence got a free extension.
Right.
It's not just about delaying adulthood.
Correct.
It's about this whole new phase of exploration and figuring out who you are as a person.
Yes. And that's becoming more and more common in our society today than it used to be.
Let's talk about those of us who are maybe a little bit older, young adulthood, typically late 20s to late 30s. This is the stage where it's all about
building a life, establishing those careers, forming deeper relationships, maybe even starting families.
Right. It's like that whole nesting instinct kicks in.
Yes.
Where we crave intimacy, connection. And Erickson called this stage
Intimacy versus isolation.
intimacy versus isolation.
It's about finding that balance between your own needs and the needs of your partner, your family. Even with the best of intentions, relationships are hard.
If you have kids, talk about a crash course in time management.
The ultimate juggling act.
But even amidst all the chaos, there's something so rewarding. So then we move into middle adulthood. This is where I think that sense of purpose shifts a little bit beyond just our immediate circle. And Erickson called this generativity versus stagnation.
Generativity versus stagnation.
Which I love.
What does that even mean?
Okay, so it's you start to think about your legacy.
What are we leaving behind?
Right. And for some people, that might mean having kids and raising a family.
Right.
And for others, it might be focusing on their career.
It's about finding that thing. That brings us to the final stage of life, what Erickson called ego integrity versus despair.
Ego integrity versus despair.
And look, we're not saying that life is over once you hit a certain age,
Right.
but this stage is often about reflecting on your life and coming to terms with choices that you made and having that sense of peace,
Peace and acceptance.
of a life well lived,
Looking back on those triumphs and the regrets
the good and the bad.
and saying, you know what, I did all right.
I did my best.
And that's what ego integrity is all about. That sense of satisfaction and acceptance.
Being content with your life.
I love that.
It's a nice thought.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into human development, what's the key takeaway?
We never really stop growing. We're always changing, always evolving, always learning.